Going Postal by Terry Pratchett, book review. So I'm trying to get more into the idea of reading for pleasure, instead of simply reading books that I think are good for me. To that end, I've started to return to the fantasy genre that I used to be a big fan of in my youth. I've discovered the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. Now, I never heard of these back when I was living in America. I think they do have them in the American bookstores, but they're not quite as popular, not quite as prominent. But when I go to a bookstore in Japan and I go to the English-speaking section, there are always a ton of these. I think because these books are much more popular in Britain and Australia and kind of other Commonwealth countries. The books are fantasy, but to compare it to two other British authors, it's much more in the line of Douglas Adams than J.R.R. Tolkien. All the stock fantasy characters are there. There are dwarves, elves, trolls, vampires, werewolves, wizards, etc. But they're also comedic, silly, and as much a parody of the genre as a part of it. Zombies are lawyers, vampires are newspaper photographers, and werewolves are policemen. Also, just about every paragraph is some sort of setup for a joke. I could quote from a lot of paragraphs, but let me just quote from one of them in particular, which seemed kind of very reminiscent of the tone of Douglas Adams' style, to me at least. So, the great hall was in an uproar. Most of the wizards took the opportunity to congregate at the buffet, which was now clear. If there's one thing a wizard hates, it's having to wait while the person in front of them is in two minds about coleslaw. It's a salad bar, they say. It's got the kind of stuff salad bars have. If it was surprising, it wouldn't be a salad bar. You're not here to look at it. What do you expect to find? Rhino chunks? Picocolams? End quote. Pratchett is very prolific. Going Postal is actually the 33rd book in the Discworld series. That's not even counting the books he writes that are not part of the Discworld series. It looks like he cranks these things out at a rate of about 1 or 2 books a year, which raises a couple questions. One, given how much of these books he cranks out, do they suffer in quality? And two, how difficult is it to jump in book 33 of an ongoing series? As for the first question, I don't know. This is the first book I've read of his. I asked a friend, though, somebody who's read a lot more Discworld, and he said, some of the books are admittedly better than others, but even the worst books in the series, you won't be sorry you read. Now, based on my experience with Going Postal, I go along with that assessment. It wasn't the best book I've ever read, but I'm not sorry I read it. It was funny. The plot was well structured. All the different story threads came together nicely at the end. I thought the characters were decently developed, or at least as well as they needed to be for a story like this. In short, I don't know how Pratchett manages to write this well and still write so much. But I got the impression he wasn't holding anything back from this book. He wasn't being stingy or saving stuff from his next novel. Kind of all of his ideas were in this book. As for jumping into the 33rd book in the series, it was no problem. Or almost no problem. There were a couple small things I had to get used to. Robot creatures called golems, for example. A tower messaging system called Clacks, run by a business organization called the Grand Trunk. Some of these things must have been set up in previous books, I'm assuming. But all of that was much easier than The Debacle by Emile Zola, which I previously read, and which I had to jump into a part of an ongoing series there. So, yeah, very accessible. Although, this may be partly because Going Postal is a bit of a narrative digression from the usual Discworld series. And most of the main characters in this book are new. This book is simply the tale of how Ankh-Morpork's postal service develops, which apparently fits into a larger Discworld theme of the growth of Ankh-Morpork as a major urban area in the Discworld. In that respect, given the tangential nature of this story in relation to the larger series, it seems all the more amazing that it was as well written as it was. If it were me, if I were writing this, I might have just blown this off because it was just a tangential story. I particularly enjoyed the character of Lord Vetinari, who is a tyrant of Ankh-Morpork. Apparently he's from the previous books as well. So he's kind of a benevolent tyrant because he's, on the one hand, he's committed to keeping his stranglehold on power, but at the same time, he's trying to do what's best for the city in his own eyes. It's interesting to have kind of that level of complexity in a character. I thought it was interesting. Now, apparently, according to Wikipedia, this book is partly a critique of the free market ideology. And apparently much of this book is a parody of Atlas Shrugged. But I've never read Atlas Shrugged, so all of that went over my head.